Hello, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the first lecture of the Spring 2025 semester series for the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in the United States, hosted by Princeton University's Keller Center. We started this series in the spring of 2021 and are thrilled to be continuing it. I'm excited to tell you about the series and then introduce you to our fantastic scholar, Dr. Jill Snider. My name is Isam Beezer, and I'm a University Administrative Fellow hosted by the Keller Center and a PhD candidate at Rutgers Business School, where I study entrepreneurship from both contemporary and historical perspectives. The center's mission is to arm our community with the intellectual foundation, innovation skills, and networks to propel positive and sustainable societal impact. As a center, we recognize the pervasive and systemic racial inequity in our country and how this is deeply linked to so many of our country's most profound challenges. We understand how important it is that our community has the understanding of these inequities as we work on solving some of humanity's most pressing challenges, which brings us to this series. For all interested in innovation and entrepreneurship, much can be learned from the entrepreneurs who have succeeded under some of the most daunting constraints. For at the end of the day, this is what entrepreneurship is about. We're about assembling a limited resource for impact. Black innovators and entrepreneurs have overcome restrictive markets, segregation, Jim Crow laws, lack of access to capital, threats of violence and death, theft of intellectual capital, and many other extreme challenges. Still, they thrived. These entrepreneurs have created innovations which have resulted in lasting societal and cultural changes far beyond the Black community. By exploring the history of Black entrepreneurship and innovation, we want to learn from the creative strategies Black entrepreneurs employed to succeed. At the same time, we want to explore how the constraints on Black entrepreneurship and business development have limited the overall economics, not only of the Black communities, but our society as a whole, and how so many of these constraints, which have become institutionalized, can be overcome in the future. This exciting series brings together scholars and academics from numerous institutions, now from all around the world, to share their scholarship in a discussion-based forum. And today we have Dr. Jill Snider. The title of her talk is "The Angels Are in the Details." Love it. She has a really impressive background, but before I give a little introduction for her, please put your questions in the Q&A box. Your questions are more important than mine, so while we have her live, which is a treat, ask as many questions as you want, and your questions will be the priority at the end, as long as we have time. So Dr. Jill Snider is an independent scholar who lives in the Washington, D.C. area. She holds a BA in English and an MA and PhD in U.S. history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has been a fellow at the Smithsonian Institute, the National Air and Space Museum, the American Historical Association, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. In her career, Snider has combined historical research and writing with work as an academic archivist, or archivist, depending on how you flow with that word, a technical writer for environmental and research firms, a program manager for the U.S. Census Bureau, and a business analyst for government IT teams. Now semi-retired, she continues to conduct research, give talks, as we thankful for that, writing and archival projects for private clients, and is at work on a book that examines how African Americans, enslaved and free, participated in and perceived ballooning technology during the antebellum and Civil War periods. That is an extremely abbreviated version of her bio. She's absolutely fantastic and so nice. Without further ado, I pass it to you, Dr. Snider. Thank you.
Thank you, Isan. That was quite a nice introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk about three different things today. I'm going to break the talk into three parts. The first part, I want to look at and give you a sense of who Headen was. Lucean Arthur Headen wore many hats in his lifetime, and one of which was an entrepreneur, a very important one of which was being an entrepreneur. He did many things that have left a great legacy for us. So the first part of the talk, I want to focus primarily on he and his career. The second part of the talk, I want to get more to what the title of the presentation indicates, looking at the methodology that I used to uncover much of Headen's life. When I began this work, as any of you know who've done this kind of work, it's very difficult because there are very few primary sources to which you can turn. A lot of the papers of people like Headen were never sought out by archives. His work was often not recognized when he was alive, outside of his small circle. And you always face this issue of, how do I write a biography of someone who I can find almost no sources for? So what I developed over time in doing my research was a methodology that I will talk about in the second half of this presentation. And if you will forgive me, I will probably read much of the second part of this talk, because it involves a lot of taking a lot of detail and pulling it together and putting it in a logical progression, so that I want to make sure that that progression comes through and is clear, so that the methodology itself is clear. And then finally, what I want to look at is what that methodology brought me to, the things that it revealed that were different from, and I think, very augmentative of, what I would have seen had I used a traditional methodology, where I had tons of sources and I just went to those sources and I wrote what the sources said. But being forced into a different kind of methodology actually revealed to me some things about the scholarship in the areas of business entrepreneurship in African Americans, history of technology in African Americans, that really are not things that I would have found any other way. So let's begin now with first Lucean Arthur Headen himself. As I said, Lucean Arthur Headen wore a lot of hats. He was born in 1879 in Carthage, North Carolina, which is the county seat of Moore County in a central part of North Carolina, the area often called the Sand Hills. He grew up there, went to Presbyterian schools, established after the Civil War. He then became a railroad porter. He worked as a porter for about a decade, as well as working as a dining car waiter for the Erie Railroad. It was one of the few professions that he could get into at the time, because this was right as Jim Crow was hitting legally. And he left North Carolina in 1903 to become a railroad porter in Jersey City, New Jersey. And he, over his lifetime, migrated many times to follow his dreams. So first he was in Jersey City, he moved to Chicago, he moved back to New York, he moved to Georgia, which you wouldn't anticipate, Albany, Georgia. He moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and then eventually he ended up in 1931, he immigrated to England. So he had to move a lot of places to follow opportunity. And he was always one to follow opportunity. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. While he was in Jersey City working as a Pullman porter, he decided that he wanted to learn to fly. So he went out to Mineola, Long Island, and he convinced them there to give him lessons. But already being an entrepreneur, he wasn't just interested in flying. He was interested in promoting an invention that he had created. It was a stabilizer for planes when they bank. He had developed a device to make that a safer maneuver and stabilize the plane. And he wanted to learn to fly, he said, because he wanted to market that. He wanted to prove its capabilities, and he wanted to be able to market it. He demonstrated this device in flights that he did in the Midwest. So he went out to Chicago and St. Louis and made flights there. And even though he wasn't able to, at the time, gain capital and develop it enough to make it profitable, he did show for the first time in his life the real push he had toward entrepreneurship, not just invention. He was very much an inventor, but he wanted to combine those two. He wanted to be both an inventor and he wanted to make money off of it. And he was one of the very few inventors of the time who actually did make a living out of his inventions. It was quite an accomplishment. So after he learned to fly, Headen moved to Chicago. There he served as a chauffeur for Robert McCormick, who was editor of the Chicago Tribune and also involved in other entrepreneurial activities himself. And McCormick really became one of his staunch allies very early and helped him promote and develop, not so much on the technical end, but more on the entrepreneurial end of helping him promote and find backers for some of his inventions. And one of those, oops, I guess I don't have that. One of those inventions was something that unfortunately I don't have a photograph of, but it was a device that he developed during World War I to help ships cloak themselves. So what the device did was it diffracted light so that the ship couldn't be seen. What would diffract back to a viewer was just water and sun. And he tried to market this invention to government contractors and to the government itself. So he first presented the invention in 1917 to the Naval Consulting Board in Washington, D.C. And they had a great interest in it, but they made the decision that the way he would diffract the light was using mirrors on the side of the ship, and that they felt the mirrors would weigh too much. And even though it worked, it would take away from the tonnage that they could carry. And they didn't want to do that. But the outcome of that was that the British Admiralty became interested in the invention and they invited him to come over and demonstrate it, which he did. And that was his first introduction to England, where he would later move. When he came back after World War I, which unfortunately his invention never was completely developed, because just as he presented it, the end of the war came along and all the research money went away. So he came back, he didn't apply for a patent on it, because at that point, after the war, so many other technologies like radar were starting to become more and more useful, and they sort of obviated the need for what he had developed. So he turned his attention to automobiles. He loved automobiles from the time he was a youngster, and he formed his own auto garage in Chicago. He got lots of investors, pulled them all together, started his garage, and it was so successful that within a year, he started his own company beyond that to design and market his own automobile and various variations of it. So he started the Headen Motor Company in 1921, and by 22, he was building custom cars and marketing them to middle-class Blacks across the country. So he did several tours around the country, selling stock in his company and demonstrating his cars. And another way of promoting his company was he started developing and organizing dirt track races. So the entrepreneurship continued to come out. He would work with people, he would go somewhere like New York or Savannah or Albany in Georgia, and he would work with local residents and business people there to put on these races, which were very successful. And in the course of doing that, he ended up moving to Albany, Georgia, which greatly surprised me after having left the South in 1903. And in Albany, he restarted his car company there. And I'll talk more later in the talk about why he chose Albany. But that's the point at which he really became a successful inventor. He'd had several almost successes, but once he got to Georgia, that's when he really started moving forward in the world of invention. The first thing he developed, and I unfortunately don't have a photo of it, and the photo that's from the patent that he received for it is sort of something that's almost impossible to understand, even if you look at it. So I didn't include it. But his first invention was for something called a spark ignition device. And he then moved on to developing other automotive devices that were related to it, but a little different. So what we see here is a picture of what's called a vaporizing manifold. So what Headen was interested in doing was taking what were called bifuel engines and making them much more efficient so that they could be used in automobiles and trucks. They'd long been used in things like tractors and ship engines, things that ran really hot. You know, when you're on a tractor, you're pulling something, a plow or whatever, and it really heats the engine up. And you need a hot engine to vaporize fuels. Gasoline will vaporize pretty quickly, but what Headen wanted to do was develop a vaporizer that would allow not only trucks and cars, but new generations of tractors and boat engines to burn crude oil, which is incredibly cheap. Crude oil is where fuel starts, and gasoline is after many sets of processes comes out. And gasoline's great for quick ignition and running smoothly, but it's very expensive. So what he wanted to do was develop these devices that would help run vehicles on cheap crude oil or things like kerosene. You know, there were different gradations of the oil. And what he wanted to do with that was develop components for a car where you could convert a car or a truck it had a normal gasoline engine, but you can convert it to run on these cheap fuels. And that is a lot of what ended up taking Headen to England to where he spent the rest of his life. England was a country that didn't have a lot of oil resources. It had to buy very expensive gasoline from other countries. A lot of its empire was based on sort of taking over countries that had oil. Whereas the US had, you know, large reserve we had a lot of oil mining or oil production capability that Britain didn't have. So he decided, he had a business partner who was born in England. His business partner owned an auto garage in Ohio, and they worked together to move his business from Albany, Georgia, to first to London and then later to a small town called Camberley in Surrey, in England. And that's where he began a career. 25 years. He started an engineering firm in Surrey, and he operated it for 25 years. And it was the British really embraced him because of his technologies. Sorry. They embraced him and they embraced his technologies because they were bringing business to an area that during the Depression was not doing well, and they had very few businesses there, manufacturing. And once he got there and he started developing his several technologies, but one of the things was a converter kit. So and that converter kit became very popular in England. And then he started working on methods in the mid and late 30s to help prevent the formation of ice and to remove ice from airplane wings, propellers, rotorcraft, those sorts of things. And he had an innovation that he called his pressure jet system, where what he would do is he would pull the hot air from the engine itself, and he would route it through pipes throughout the wings and the fuselage and back to the tail section of the plane. And the other people had done this, but what he was using was this system where in the piping, he had apertures in the piping that became larger as you got further away from the source of the hot air, so that it was more even. And he also added the ability to shoot the air up right at the critical points of the airplane. So things like the hinges that controlled the tail, anything that would become a hindrance to flying the plane and keeping it stable. So he introduced this during World War II, and unfortunately, because of the way war work was done, and he was on the outside of that war work, it didn't get a ton of attention at the time, though there were people who referenced him in their patents of the time. But long term, it had a great legacy because that idea was used and is still used today as a basis for a lot of the systems that companies developed in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s and 90s that they used for de-icing planes. And to date, that technology is still used to help de-ice and prevent the formation of ice on wind turbines. So we see that even though he didn't always gain recognition for his work, especially in the broader public, he did gain recognition from people within his own field. So mechanical engineers knew who Headen was, and they knew his ideas, and they adapted and used his ideas over the years, and they still are doing that today. And I just wanted to show you a photograph of Headen. This is him a little later in life when he first moved to England and was living in London before he found a business partner in Surrey. Okay, this is the part where I think I want to start reading. And I want to do that. This is part 2, where I look at the actual method that I used to learn about Headen's life. It was easier to learn about some of the technical aspects than it was about his life itself. And the question, there are lots of questions that as a biographer you want to ask. And if you don't have personal items, you don't have letters, you don't have people's diaries or people writing about him, it's very difficult to understand what are the motivations of this individual, what are the ways he was able to do what he did. And to answer those questions, I kind of developed a methodology over time that I want to talk about today. And I'm going to read this because it has a lot of detail and it has a lot of logic that I want to follow, and I want to make sure that that comes through to you. So section 2 of the talk, building circumstantial narrative using what I call the macro-micro method, in which I move back and forth between scholarly and other sources and this micro level that I was able to get to through genealogical resources. So when I began work on Headen, I started with just a few newspaper articles that I was able to find, most of which, unfortunately, as any of you who've ever worked with newspapers know, had a lot of misinformation about them. Took me forever to figure out where he was from, because in about 4 or 5 different articles, he was listed as from a different place in each one. There were no encyclopedia entries or biographical entries for Headen, and I couldn't locate very many records at all. So what I was able to find after several years of research was about 20 letters, most of which were pretty short and businesslike, and a few items that included the prospectus for his car company in Chicago, a few photographs, and his naturalization record from his son. And I knew that even though I had those things and they were wonderful, they weren't going to be enough to tell me what I needed to know. So what I did, and how I got around the paucity of these sources, was to answer the questions that I had to ask. How did he finance his inventions and his businesses? What education did he receive? What were his early relationships and experiences like? And who was the person, or who were the people who encouraged him? I was able to probe Headen's life in part by using a method that I modeled on Professor Juliet E.K. Walker's work in the 1980s. In 83, Walker wrote the biography Free Frank about Frank McWhorter, her great-great-grandfather. McWhorter was formerly an enslaved man who had bought his own freedom and started an all-black town in Illinois in the 1830s. Almost all the records he and his family had preserved over many years tragically were burned in a house fire. So Walker took the one small box that remained, and she wrote his story by placing the surviving items into the context of published scholarly works on slavery, on the experience of free Blacks, and on life on the frontier. Extrapolating from the scholarship, she filled in many of the gaps in Free Frank's life by surmising what many of his experiences were likely to have been. It occurred to me that I could do something similar for Headen. I could use the scholarship that's blossomed over the past 40 years on African American life and culture, invention, migration, and other topics as a means to build a basic understanding of Headen's world. The scholarship could serve as a lens through which to better interpret the very few items that I did have. I could then also take a second step. Walker, when she wrote Free Frank, did not have available the wide array of digital tools that we have today. I decided that in addition to trying to understand what might be called the macro environment in which Headen operated, I could also try to understand his micro environment. I could consult the hundreds of genealogical records, church minutes and publications, newspaper social columns, business and city directories, tax records, school catalogs, fraternal organs, trade journals, and similar sources available online to map out not only his life, but the lives of his family members and business associates. Thus, I could recreate the more immediate fabric of the social and economic world he inhabited. So in the absence of people having written about him and the people in whose lives he was embedded, I could, using these genealogical records, recreate that for myself. So combining the bird's eye view provided by scholarship and this close-up view, I hope to create, in effect, a silhouette of Headen. The more I learned about those who surrounded him and their activities, the more I could fill in the relief of that silhouette. And eventually, as he came into sharper focus, I could ask, one, better questions of the small number of sources I had, and two, identify new places to look for answers. To make my point, I want to give you a few examples of the kinds of macro source, or I'm sorry, the kinds of micro sources that I used to uncover Headen's story and to point out significant patterns that emerged from them. I will then give an example of how the interplay of the macro and the micro made it possible to weave together, in the absence of traditional sources, a strong circumstantial case for who Headen was and what motivated his decisions. So let me start with the role of micro sources. One of the first questions I had when I began my work on Headen was who sparked his interest in invention and who encouraged and supported him. He himself left no written record of his past, so I turned to genealogical records to see if I could find out. I began my work in the US Census. Census records gave me the names of Headen's parents and the name of his grandparents, with whom he and his sister lived after his mother's early death. It also gave me the names of all his maternal aunts and uncles and of extended family members. Knowing the names, I was able to create genealogical profiles of each person, who they married, where they migrated, and who their children were. Using this family tree, I began searching in city directories, school catalogs, deeds and court records, tax books, newspapers, publications, government records, death records and wills, church minutes and publications, so many of them online now, for details on individuals' occupations, employers, associates, and activities. Soon I had compiled biographies of each family member that documented not only their activities, but for some, also what the press or scholarly works might have said about them. From this detailed level micro-portrait of Headen's family, I learned an enormous amount. I had no letters exchanged with family members, but I discovered nonetheless that Headen was the child of an entrepreneur himself. His father, Jerry Headen, had opened a sawmill in Carthage, North Carolina in 1893 after a major fire burned much of the forest surrounding the town. A number of small mills, like Jerry Headen's, popped up to salvage wood from partially burned trees. Lucian was also the grandchild of a skilled and prosperous wheelwright, who, when still enslaved, had been one of the original workers in Carthage's primary industry, the Tyson and Jones Buggy Company. It soon after the 1850s became the largest buggy making firm in the South. And after the Civil War, his grandfather became himself an entrepreneur. He continued to work at the buggy company, but he also operated a local store with a cousin. Headen was, too, the grandnephew of Joseph Tyson, a nationally known blacksmith and tool designer who sold his creations from New England to New Orleans. So you can see he had a tradition of entrepreneurship and innovation in his family. Headen also received an excellent education in a Presbyterian school called Dayton Academy in Carthage. It was founded and supported by his childhood minister, Reverend Henry Davis Wood. The school, I found from county business directories, church minutes, and newspaper articles, was staffed mostly by Henry Wood's wife, Annie, and by Headen's aunts, uncle, and an older sister. So he also came from a family very dedicated to education. From this family portrait, the social scaffolding that surrounded Headen slowly became visible. I discovered that not only did he grow up around machines, watching family members work, but one of his uncles, Henry Tyson, whose life took a more academic path, wrote glowingly about the future of technology for newspapers in his hometown and later in Washington, D.C. A classmate and close friend of novelist Charles Chesnutt at the Howard School in Fayetteville, Henry later became a leader in the Bethel Literary and Historical Association in Washington, the intellectual home to several Black inventors. According to federal government employment registers and personal columns found in Black newspapers, Henry worked alongside and vacationed on the Maryland shore, not only with them, but also with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office's only Black patent examiner, Henry Baker. It would be Henry Tyson's address, found in the city directory, that Headen supplied as where he was staying in 1917, when he first demonstrated his optical device to the Naval Consulting Board in Washington. This demonstration was what had piqued the interest of the British Admiralty. In addition, in 1921, when Headen started his car company in Chicago, former South Carolina Congressman George Murray traveled with him to help sell stock. I knew from the scholarship on early African-American political figures who Murray was, but from newspaper coverage of Henry Tyson's political activities, I learned that Tyson and Murray had been close political allies in the Republican Party for more than 2 decades. Thus, despite having no smoking gun to prove that Henry Tyson was a strong supporter of his nephew's career, a preponderance of evidence was emerging that indicated this was true. In fact, what I quickly discovered as I traced out the family's activities was that Headen's Uncle Henry was far from his only supporter. Throughout his life in the United States, in fact, Headen relied heavily on political, religious, fraternal, and other networks that his family, his childhood pastor, and his wife Tina Dry helped create. For example, after Headen completed his primary education at Dayton Academy in Carthage, he enrolled in Albion Academy, an advanced Presbytery preparatory school in Franklinton, North Carolina. There, his pastor had earlier been vice president of the board of trustees of the school. When Headen moved to Chicago in 1912, he found employment as a chauffeur with the powerful McCormick family, owners of International Harvester and the Tribune. Cyrus McCormick Jr. had served on the board of trustees of Albion with Reverend Wood, and his home church in Chicago, as well as McCormick personally, had provided direct support for the school. This fact, culled from an Albion school catalog and Presbyterian General Assembly minutes, suggested strongly that Headen's employment resulted from a national Presbyterian network in which Wood was active. Further evidence for this came from the fact that several members of the McCormick family, not only Robert, who was his direct employer, but also from Robert's brother, U.S. Senator Medill Cormick, who subsequently took measures to help Headen gain a government audience for his optical cloaking device. Similarly, early investors and supporters of Headen's car company included many individuals Headen's wife met through Lafayette Presbyterian Church in Jersey City, and later Grace Presbyterian in Chicago. Headen himself had little affinity for church life, but Tina was a leading member and church organizer, and she made a lot of friends. In addition, professional and fraternal colleagues of Headen's brother-in-law, William Jones, a pharmacist in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, gave Headen access to other networks. One of the first people Headen sought out when he moved to Chicago was pharmacist George Porter, with whom Will Jones often worked on projects within the National Medical Association. As he traveled to promote his car company, Headen was often hosted by state leaders of the Prince Hall Masons, of which Jones was a very long-time member, and whose older brother, Joseph Jones, was the North Carolina state head. Headen relied on the state heads in Tennessee and Georgia to help him with his promotions. The more I probed the lives of those surrounding Headen through micro sources, the more such patterns I began to see. And it was these patterns that helped me understand how critical the religious, political, and social ties of his family were to Headen's ability to finance and carry out his early work. The importance of microsources became even more clear to me late in the biography project when I discovered by chance a critical piece of Headen's personal history, about which I had been completely unaware. As part of my work, I decided to track all of Headen's business partners and investors and see what I could learn about them. One of them, a man who joined Headen Motor Company's board of trustees in 1923, was named James Street. Street intrigued me because he was listed as being from Tampa, Florida. And I knew from newspaper coverage that another Tampan, Blanche Armwood Beatty, served that year as the company's treasurer. I was familiar with Beatty from scholarly work on her life as a nationally influential educator, but I had no idea how Headen might have met her or who Street was. Street appeared only sporadically in Tampa newspapers, and mention of him gave little information. So I turned again to genealogical records, and as I delved into them, lo and behold, what do I discover? On his death certificate, it notes that Street was married to Beatty's sister, Idella Armwood, and that Street had been born in Jonesboro, North Carolina. Jonesboro was the town Headen's father was from, and where Headen himself, although born in Carthage, spent the first 2 years of his life. And the death certificate listed Headen's father, Jerry Headen, as also James's father. Headen had a half-brother who, born out of wedlock, had taken his mother's name. So James was his brother, and Blanche was his brother's sister-in-law. A family network, rather than simply an entrepreneurial one, was at work. I was able to gain additional details on the Headen Street Armwood relationship from perhaps the least likely source of all, a building contractor's trade journal. When Headen moved his car company from Chicago to Albany, Georgia in 1925, he purchased an abandoned canning factory and hired a contractor to expand the space. Contractors' trade journals, many of them now available online, historically listed most new permitted building projects across the country. They also describe the work being done and the contractor carrying it out, and fortuitously, sometimes the name of the architect. In this case, I learned that Headen had hired Walter Armwood, Blanche and Adela's brother, to design the addition. Armwood was a trained architect, but had difficulty obtaining work in his field in Florida, where he faced resistance from white architects. And he spent much of his life teaching to make ends meet. So Headen's going to him and giving him the work was a show of family solidarity. This bit of information, hidden in an obscure source, told me two things. One, that although the brother James had died suddenly only a few months after joining Headen Motor, more than a year later, Headen still maintained a relationship of warmth and trust with his brother's in-laws, and the families maintained financial ties. These were just a few examples of how microsources helped me uncover family relationships, Headen's early influences, and the role that the networks his family and pastor created played in supporting financing his work. Now, focusing for a moment on a single time period in Headen's life, I want to illustrate the methodology more fully, showing how macro and micro sources can be used together, moving back and forth between them, to fill in what we have limited evidence for and illuminate the thinking of an inventor or entrepreneur. When I learned that Headen had moved to Albany, Georgia from Chicago in 1925, I was scratching my head. Why would he make that move? He had left North Carolina in 1904 when Jim Crow violence and restrictions became unbearable. A small southern city, Albany was one of the most strictly segregated places in the South, known for frequent and often horrific racial violence, and for the economic exploitation of Black laborers, most of whom either worked as service positions or were sharecroppers heavily indebted to white landowners. So why would Headen, who had first gone to Albany only to organize an auto race, choose it as a new location for his company? I first looked for clues in academic work on Albany and its environs. Reading on the social, economic, and political environment of the city, I hoped would help me see how Headen, within a broader context, would allow me to better interpret his actions. What the scholarship told me was that city leaders in Albany were in the mid-1920s intensely interested in economic development, and that they had visions of rivaling the tourist and real estate boom then undergoing in neighboring Florida. To that end, officials were beginning to adopt extensive measures to encourage business. Cutting taxes to the lowest level in the state, they also poured money into improving Albany's roads and other infrastructure. All of this, I could see, would appeal to a businessman like Headen. But still, why Albany? Skimming through the city directory, I began to develop a fuller theory. There I noticed advertisements for numerous small automobile manufacturing firms, sometimes not typical of other southern cities. As well as a favorable business environment, Albany offered him a technical and entrepreneurial community supportive of his ambitions. He would create a strong alliance with at least one white automotive entrepreneur within that community, Henry Pettit. And with Pettit, he would co-develop his first invention, the Headen-Pettit spark ignition device. In addition, Albany's desire to grow and to establish itself as a tourist destination also raised hopes for a friendlier racial environment. To attract outside investment, white city leaders knew they would have to address the issue of violence. This was doubly important because African Americans were then beginning to leave Georgia in large numbers, joining the Great Migration north and west. An extensive literature documents this outmigration, as well as Albany's role as a central point of departure for migrants who traveled to the city from many areas to catch trains north. Witnessing the labor supply key development disappearing, city planners were beginning to look to improve, if not transform, race relations. To understand what this meant for Headen, I needed to know more about his relationship with Albany's white leaders and with leaders in the Black business community. I found clues to the first through the local newspaper, where I discovered a number of articles on Headen and his interactions with members of the Chamber of Commerce and others. His relationship to the Black community was less visible, so I turned again to genealogical sources. I started with the census, which gave me Headen's place of residence and the names of the people with whom he lived. Using the census and World War I registration records, city directories, tax listings, and other sources, I was able to trace the backgrounds of the couple, William and Emma Wynn, with whom he boarded. The records told me that the Wynns were small entrepreneurs. William, a cook for many years, had recently moved to Albany to open a cafe, and Emma had opened a beauty salon. I then used organizational publications and city directories to document the couple's political, financial, and club ties, which illuminated the social networks in which Headen was embedded. When William Wynn was active in the Elks and the NAACP, and his wife, Emma Wynn, was a statewide organizer for the City Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. She also became a principal investor in Headen's car company. Next, I explored the company itself, using tax records to determine the size and profitability and incorporation announcements appearing in the local paper to obtain the name of his other primary investor. I then traced this investor's background and activities in genealogical records and newspapers, building a complete economic and social profile of his partners. I could tell that they were all of limited financial resources, unlike in Chicago, where he had been able to rely, at least in part, on several well-heeled Black businessmen. Here, all were of modest means. Once I knew this, I could better understand the position Headen had, and others in the Black business community in Albany were in, and the relationships he had with both city leaders and with them. They all, in some ways, were united in common cause to stem outmigration. For white city planners, Black laborers were necessary to fulfill their plans for growth. For the Wynns and others, they were crucial as customers. For Headen, the well-being of Black entrepreneurs and professionals such as the Wynns was crucial because they were the demographic to which he hoped to sell all his cars. A man of considerable organizational experience and political savvy, Headen took on the role for other Black entrepreneurs as their liaison with white city leaders. This became apparent as I began to look again at the newspaper articles I had found on Headen, articles that I had at first found confusing. They discussed Headen's having organized, with the help of one of his business partners, a Black agricultural fair. For a man who'd never shown the slightest interest in agriculture at the point in his life, I had to wonder, what was his motivation? Headen also led the effort to raise money within Albany's Black community to support a project by white city leaders to finance the building of a tourist hotel. Why, I wondered, had he done that? Now, considering the need to keep Albany's Black population from further diminishing, I could see that his efforts were in the service of his and other local entrepreneurs' economic interests. The fair, by bringing together Black farmers from across the country and giving them a place where they could display their work and be rewarded for it, encouraged them to stay in Georgia. And fundraising efforts for the city were a show of cooperation. Headen and others in the Black business community would support city projects if the city would work to create a better racial climate. That would both improve their daily lives and eliminate one of the forces pushing Blacks to leave. The strategy yielded some results as city officials, albeit slowly, began to take action on racial issues, changing an old policy, for instance, to no longer allow the KKK to hold initiation rites in the municipal auditorium as it traditionally had. In this macro-micro process, scholarly publications help me understand the economic and social factors at play in Albany. And micro sources help me build the profile of Headen's business, needed for me to put him and it into the context that the scholarship provide. As a result, I could begin to build a reasonable circumstantial case for what Headen's motivations were. As I delved deeper, the same process unfolded. As I considered Headen's agricultural fair, I began to wonder about his relationship not only to the city's white and Black business elites, but to the farmers who participated in the fair. A prospectus he published for his company in the Albany Herald specifically stated that in addition to car manufacturing, the new firm would also offer tractor repair. From this, I realized that the fair had a secondary purpose to appeal to potential rural customers. This led me to consider Headen's earlier actions prior to starting his car company, when he had promoted auto races in Albany and in nearby Macon, Georgia. To advertise the events, Headen had traveled to speak in numerous small towns in and around the two cities. Most of the people he met on these publicity tours, of course, were farmers. I hadn't thought much about this, however, until trying to answer another question. I had found in the Albany City Directory an entry for a man named Henry Benton Plummer, Jr., who was listed as legal counsel for Headen Motor Company. The scholarship on Black nationalism told me that Plummer, a lawyer, had been a high-profile member of the Garvey movement in New York, serving as head of the publicity for Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, and as leader of the UNIA's paramilitary African Legion. The UNIA was then under attack from white government officials and from many middle-class Blacks who saw Garvey as a swindler and who supported the federal government's recent imprisonment of him for mail fraud. They had also attacked Plummer, convicting him of financial fraud on more than one occasion. So, scratching my head again, I had to ask, why would Headen employ Plummer and give him so much a prominent position in his organization? Headen had never shown any affinity for Black nationalism. He, in fact, was close friends with Robert Abbott, editor of the Chicago Defender, who was a scathing critic of Garvey. And as I had a hard time thinking that Plummer would have been readily embraced by a clubwoman such as Emma Wynn. Here again, the marriage of the macro and the micro suggested answers, and it had to do with farmers. From newspaper coverage, I mapped out all the locations to which Headen had traveled to promote his auto races, and then I began reading about the racial makeup and politics in these areas. What I discovered in scholarship on Black nationalism in Georgia was that all these towns were nationalist strongholds, each having a thriving UNIA chapter. In fact, together they comprise the strongest belt of support for Garveyism in the entire state. Plummer, a nationally known leader in the organization, had earlier played a role in recruiting for the UNIA in Georgia, and his standing locally gave Headen entree into small towns and farming communities that without Plummer's presence, he may never have been welcomed into. I had no letters or publications saying this was true, but I had a strong argument for why Headen might have hired Plummer. As you can see, micro sources proved a gold mine in my research on Headen, providing crucial clues in the absence of archival records. They also allowed me to uncover important relationships and social networks. And by placing these relationships and networks within the larger context provided by the scholarship, I was able to hone the portrait I was building of Headen as a savvy political businessman. So I'd like to move on now to final section. And I know his.
Hi, Jill. I was wondering, we're heading close to the 1:30 stop time. Is there any is the third section enough time to finish by 1:30 Eastern?
What time is it now?
1:28.
No.
No, no worries.
Um, so I'll start it.
Sure,
And,
sure.
and you can cut me off when it's 1:30.
Okay, no problem.
So to finish, what I want to talk about in the final section, and I know we're running out of time, but maybe we can expand this a little into the questions, is what I learned from this micro methodology. It expanded my understanding of Black business strategies, because one of the things I was able to find was the origin of what I considered Headen's coalition method of doing business. So he brought together all kinds of people of different ages, different races, different fields, and was able to bring all these people together to finance his inventions. So he could get the McCormicks, he could get church people, he could get lots of different people and that's a strategy that I had never seen before in the scholarship on Black business history. I'd seen groups like fraternal organizations pulling together, but I'd never seen one do this broad sweep of bring everybody that you possibly can in. And I figured out that he was able to do that. He based that strategy on the strategy of his childhood pastor, who had built a church and a school doing exactly that. The other thing I learned from this method was something that I hadn't thought about much before, because the scholarship doesn't write much about it, was the role of Black women in transportation technologies, not just as users of the technology, but as investors and active participants. And then finally, I think what this allowed me to see was that when I started looking at the automobiles that Headen was selling and how they were being used through personals columns in newspapers, what I was seeing is that a lot of times when you do history, like from an American studies perspective, you go out and you look at all the sources for whites and you come up with a theory, and then you kind of fit Black people into it. But what I was seeing by looking at that micro level was that people were actually using the automobile. Well, much of what was said in the American Studies view was true. It was giving me information I wasn't getting from that, because it was a different kind of sources. And what I was finding was that people were using them to both create and maintain social networks that migration was breaking apart. So they were using them by visiting people in the hospital in another state, or visiting family members when they moved away, even within the same state. They were using them to create social connections with people in the new locations. And I think that is something about automobility, as it's called, that I would not have seen otherwise. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Snider. I'm so inspired. My notes are absolutely insane. I'm gonna be a data hog for the next 2 years at least with your ideas. So thank you so much. I'm really excited for the roundtable where we can be reintroduced, reminded of this, and you can expand upon some of the things we didn't cover, which is yeah, really looking forward to it.
Great.
So we usually try to stay sharp with the time. So thank you for your flexibility and give us a few extra minutes. And all right, so everyone, this concludes today's event. Thank you again, Dr. Snider, for really just, yeah, we're very lucky to have you here. Thank you, the attendees, and of course, the Keller Center and Princeton University for continuing to enthusiastically support and host this lecture series. It's been quite a few years now, 4 years, and uh, yeah, I've been in it, and it's genuine and amazing. So each semester, as a reminder, we have numerous lectures and a concluding roundtable. So again, sign up, get here live, ask your questions, and until our next lecture, visit the website, watch the previous recordings of the lectures. They're all online on YouTube, very easy to access, and share them. This is a public good that we want to be shared and people to learn. Dr. Snider's talk is an example of, prime example of this, where it's about methods and history and theorizing, and it's very exciting. Yeah. So again, thank you. Take care, everyone, and goodbye for now.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.